This endgame was played in the U.S. Masters Tournament in Chicago, 1997. My opponent was a master named Bettinelli, and we reached a position in which I had two pieces for a rook and pawn. This kind of position is actually the type that beginners consistently misevaluate, so we'll take our time on it. When I was a kid, I also preferred a rook to two pieces. It was easier to coordinate and it could cover great distances. But the better you get, the more you'll like the bishop-knight tandem. So check out the position on the board. Now I'm going to show you how he got here. So we had this middle game position. My opponent did something which a lot of players do. He played knight takes f2. This actually occurs quite a bit in an opening called the Italian, where white will play knight takes f7, rook takes f7, and bishop takes f7, king takes f7. A lot of beginners do this. Now my opponent isn't a beginner, of course. He did it for a good reason. He believed that the position was better for him. But I don't think he was right. I played rook takes f2. He played bishop takes f2, queen takes f2, queen takes f2, king takes f2. Then he played b4, and here I played knight d5, knight takes d5, e takes d5, bishop takes d5. This is a long tactic. And now I played rook a5. So if he defends his bishop, I can play king e3 to solidify and then take the a6 pawn. He played bishop back to c6. I played rook takes e5, rook takes e5, bishop takes e5. And here we've reached our position. It's important for you to notice the trade on f2, because it occurs quite a bit. And now you'll learn why not to do it. Watch how I won this game. He played rook e8, attacking my bishop. I played bishop d6, attacking the b4 pawn. And he played bishop e4, trading. And now we're going to start to see the differences in the position. First of all, going back a move, we see that my bishops dominate the whole board. My only real weakness is the c2 pawn, and my light square bishop defends it, which is why, in fact, he decided to make that trade. His b4 pawn is a weakness, and his a6 pawn is a weakness. If he defends by playing a5, then his a5 pawn will be a weakness. My three pieces are tremendously well coordinated. I play knight f5, for instance. I'm threatening knight e7 check. I'm threatening knight d4. I'm threatening bishop c7. After bishop c7, he plays rook a8, and then maneuvering my knight to e3 and c4 to win the a5 pawn. It's very, very hard for him to defend. He didn't like the coordination of all my pieces, so he played bishop e4. I was happy to oblige. Bishop takes e4, rook takes e4, and now we've reached the position that we'll analyze. What would you think if you reached this position? So first of all, black has a rook and a pawn against a bishop and a knight. Now most players know that a bishop is worth about 3 pawns, a knight is worth about 3 pawns, a rook is worth about 5 pawns, and a pawn is of course worth a pawn, so that would be 6 to 6 pawns. That's a very mathematical way of looking at the position, and it would be very misleading to think of things that way. In fact, this is pretty much a winning position for white, and I know a lot of players who would try to get into this position for black, because they wouldn't understand how well the pieces can coordinate. And now we'll learn. I began with knight f5. Notice once again the theme of the active king. My king is on f2. It's ready to play king e3, king d4 to come into the struggle. His king, on the other hand, is on g8. It can't come to f8 because of my bishop. It's separate from everything. I'm even threatening knight e7 check, which will try to entice his king all the way to the corner, king h8, because if he goes to king f8, he'll have all sorts of different discovered checks to worry about. For instance, knight d5 check, picking off the b4 pawn. He played g6. What would you do now? There's no sense in checking him. If knight e7 check, he'll play king g7, which is what he wanted to do anyway. Where are his weaknesses? The queen side. The b4 pawn is a weakness, and if it's defended, the a5 pawn will be a weakness. The key is to undermine those pawns. What is a great square for my knight? c4. I decided to play knight to c4. I played knight e3. In the endgame, a lot of the time, you don't think tactically, but you think strategically. You discover the ideal posts for your pieces, and then you occupy them. Knight e3 has the idea of knight c4. He played f5, which makes sense. He's preparing to both activate his king, and he's mobilizing his kingside pawn majority. I played knight c4. His b4 pawn is under attack. He can't play a5 because if knight takes a5. He's losing a pawn. King f7, activating the king. He realized correctly there's nothing he can do. I play bishop takes b4. Now, of course, I'm threatening knight d6 check with a fork. He plays king e6, activating the king. So now we've won a pawn. We have bishop and knight against rook. What's the next step of our plan? The next step should be to advance the queenside pawns. My knight is in the way and my bishop is in the way. So we have to reorganize our pieces a bit now. We've accomplished the first step, winning the b pawn. I played bishop c3. King d5. Now I played king f3. King c5. Knight e3. I'm beginning a reorganization process. My idea is to eventually play c4 and then b4. Let's see how I get there. He played rook back to e8. Bishop d2. We know my plan. He played king c6. So I played c4. Now, if he had played a move like rook d8, I could have played b4 check right away if I wanted to. His king goes to b5 and I played c4 check right away. My pawns are coming. Now, if you recall from studying the bishop endgames, I described that the most effective way to push a pawn when you have a bishop is to push it on squares of the opposite color of your bishop, so that way you can cover both light and dark squares. In this position, my pawns cover the light squares, and my bishop covers the holes between them, the dark squares. If, on the other hand, I had pawns, for instance, on c3 and b4, obviously this would be far less coordinated because the light squares would have holes and my bishop's mobility would be cut down. After c4, he played rook b8. What did I play? That's easy. b4. Notice how my bishop and knight cover all the squares they want to. There's a beautiful coordination between these two pieces, and if they're used well, they can dominate the chessboard. He went back, rook e8. So now we've established step 2 of our plan. First we won the pawn, then we advanced the pawns the first step, c4 and b4. Now what? Well, obviously now it's time to push them further, but we're going to need the king for that. Now it's time to bring the king into the action. I began with bishop c3. He played king d6. Black has no active options, he can just wait. And now I played a quiet move, g3, just restraining him. My king is going to be leaving the king side soon, and I don't want to allow f4. He can't play g5 because the f5 pawn is weak. This is a good move, holding off his pawn. He played king back to c6. I played king e2, bringing the king into the game. Now you notice, of course, that if my pawn had been on g2, I would have lost a piece here, f4. He played rook d8. He saw my plan was to play king d3. He stopped it. Knight c2. My pieces are reshuffling now, preparing the next series of advances. King b6. There's nothing black can do. Now knight d4. And here we feel the next step. I'm covering the light squares. My pawns might go another step forward. Rook e8 check. My king comes in, king d3. I've taken over the d-file. And rook e4. So let's return now and look at the position not so long ago. Here, black had a rook and pawn against a bishop and knight. The material seemed relatively even. Who's to say who's better? But the key thing to understand is that the transformation from this position to that 15 moves later was completely inevitable. The bishop and knight had complete control of the board. There was really nothing black could do to stop it. The bishop-knight tandem can be devastating against a rook in the right position. I played bishop d2. I could have played c5 check immediately. The king would have to retreat and then bishop d2. But there's no need to rush. In this position, black is inevitably falling. The key to my play has been patience. I stopped all of black's ideas with moves like g3, and I slowly developed my own play. I won the pawn, I slowly pushed my pawns, I maneuvered my king to the queen side, and now I'm organizing my pieces just right before I push my pawns. I played bishop d2, which is at once preparing the moves bishop e3 and bishop f4, so my c-pawn can go all the way up the board, and stopping all of his counterplay, because now the moves g5 and f4 are defended once more. He played rook back to e8, and now c5 check. The king goes back to b7, and now who enters the game? Once again the active king, king c4. Now notice that I only pushed my pawns onto the dark squares when I had total control already of the light squares. My knight on d4 is key. b5 and c6 are totally covered. There's a wall here, and there's no way for black to set up any blockade. My next step will be to occupy the d5 square with my king maybe, and that can be easily accomplished by playing bishop f4 to d6, followed by king d5. He played rook e5. I played bishop f4. He played rook e1. I played king d5, preparing the pawn. He played rook d1. And now to add insult to injury, I played the quiet move, h4. Stopping all of his play on the king side once again. There's nothing he can do. No weaknesses. He played rook d3. And now the final onslaught, c6 check, king c8, and king c4. Attacking the rook. All that's left is a knight check. All I have to do is attack the c8 square with my knight and it'll be all over. He played rook d1, and I played b5. Of course, you can't allow b6 or b takes a6. A takes b5, knight takes b5, and here he resigned because there's no way for him to stop my threat, which is a knight check, and then c7 and c8. He can't even guard the queening square because c1 is covered by my bishop. I could even bring my king c5 to b6 if I needed to. Black is paralyzed. The bishop and knight dominated the board. This is a very important example. Take to heart the power of the bishop and knight combination. In a similar way, 3 pieces against a queen can be very strong, or 2 rooks against a queen. A lot of beginners prefer the big piece to the little pieces because they're easier to use. Easier to use a queen alone than it is to use 3 pieces together in coordination. But trust me, you put the 3 of them together, they can do a lot of damage.